And I think a big part of the reason why is we started looking at everything as a linear system. No matter how you're growing a potato crop, you're always going to have these problems surrounding you that you're going to have to deal with, whether it be pest insects, a disease that grows on the plant or in the soil, fertility, all these issues. But the trouble is we thought we could solve all these problems in a direct fashion. If we had a problem, let's go ahead and try to remove that problem. And we weren't looking at how the system all fit together. So if you look at a lot of the solutions we were trying to use here, there's a real common theme here with a lot of these solutions. Do you guys see what it is? Side. Have you guys ever looked up side in the dictionary? Do you know what that word literally means? It means death. So here we were trying to grow a living crop to feed people, to sustain life, but we were trying to use death to solve our problems. And that's where we started running into these issues. So if we take this system and look at this, what we had to realize is just there were other factors here that really mess up that linear thought process. So we weren't taking things into consideration like the beneficial insects, the life on the plant, life in the soil, carbon and soil structure were things that we were neglecting. So we grow certified seeds, so that means pest insects can be a threat to us. The number one pest insect that's threatening to us are aphid. Aphid spread virus throughout a potato crop, and in part of being a certified seed grower, I have to meet certain tolerances on these viruses. So if I don't do anything to manage these aphid, they will spread virus all through my potato crop, and I won't have a crop I can sell at the end of the year. So early on, we identified this aphid as a threat. So of course, we started coming in with an insecticide. We thought, well, let's remove that threat from the system. But the trouble is we just stopped there, and we didn't look at what other impacts we might have. So we're going out there with these broad spectrum pesticides and insecticides and killing off not only the pests, but all the beneficial insects. Now this is where the problems truly started. Because we had two different groups of insects here, right? We had insects that fed off of plants, and we had insects that fed off of the other insects. So when you come in with an insecticide and wipe both of them from the system, which one's going to come back first? Well, the one that's going to come back first is one that's going to feed off of the plants. So by choosing this as our solution, we actually created an opportunity for an even bigger problem to present itself. Because if you go in with an insecticide one time and wipe them both out, now the pest insect actually has an opportunity to come back in even larger force and cause more problems for us. So now the solution is not only are you having to use that insecticide one time, but now you're creating a bigger problem. So now you have to come in with the insecticide more often. You're putting on more applications. You're changing the chemistry because now you might be developing some resistance with those aphids. So you have to keep changing that up. And it kind of creates a slippery slope. Now we have to continue down that path. But the problems aren't just isolated to what we were doing to the beneficial insects on the plant, but we're also having a huge impact on a lot of other insects that we weren't taking into consideration. There was a lot of different insects on the soil surface and down in the soil that were being impacted by this approach as well. So we were killing a lot of life in the soil by using this, trying to attack that one problem. Now, a very similar problem was happening with our use of fungicides and soil fumigants. Now, we had a lot of disease that could be problematic that lives in the soil and on the plant, so we were trying to use different ways of killing off these problems. But the trouble is, a lot of these fungicides, if you were to take them into a lab and test them on those diseases, sure, they do a good job of killing off that disease. But when you're using a lot of these broad spectrums, we're also killing off a lot of the beneficial fungi that might be living on the plant or in the soil. And once we start doing that, a lot of that life on the plant and in the soil actually do a really good job of controlling those diseases for us. But once we take this approach and start trying to kill our problem, now we've all created a situation where we are actually more vulnerable to an epidemic and an outbreak and having huge economic losses by doing this. So now we have to put on more and more fungicides. We've got our 10-day applications. We're starting to change the chemistry on that because we're developing some resistance here as well. So I've got a good friend that refers to this as the more on theory, right? If some work, then you got to put more on. And so this was the approach we were taking, and we never seemed to get on top of our problems. And like I said, we were also removing a lot of the beneficial life in the soil that had the potential to control these problems for us. But now is where it got real interesting. Because when my grandpa was farming potatoes back in the 50s, he was never worried about parasitic nematodes. Now, in potato production, parasitic nematodes can be devastating if left unchecked, because they'll actually lay their eggs in the potatoes, and when they hatch, they create these bubbles, these blisters all over the potatoes, makes them unmarketable, and it'll destroy the crop for us. But what's really interesting about this is where parasitic nematodes first came into the valley and caused problems is where the heaviest amounts of fungicides and soil fumigants were being used. So why would that be? We're talking about two completely different things here, right? The nematodes are these little worm-like structures in the soil, and fumigants in the soil, and the fungicides are for controlling a completely different problem. But we weren't looking at this holistically. Sorry about that. Okay, so the things we weren't taking into consideration were these. So there are many different species of beneficial fungi that live in the soil that actually do a tremendous job of trapping and killing nematodes for us. And this is just one example. And here's a nice little video that shows one of these guys in action. But there's this one specific beneficial fungi in the soil that has these lassos on it. And it's pretty cool is when those nematodes swim through there, it triggers that lasso. It clamps down on that nematode. It'll hold on to it. It'll eventually kill that nematode, and then it'll feed on it, and some different bacteria will come on later on as well and use that nematode as part of its food source. But the trouble is when we were using the fungicides and the soil fumigants, we were removing these beneficial fungi from the soil along with some other beneficial fungi. And now we were the ones that created the opportunity for the nematodes to now come in and cause problems for us. So it was really, the first step we had to take was kind of realizing that the practices we were using were creating these other problems. So now we have a parasitic nematode problem. So you can see by looking at this slide, so what's our next approach going to be? More death, right? So now we have another living thing that we need to try to kill off. So now we start using nematicides, trying to kill off another problem. And the other big factor with this too is, do you think these nematicides are free? This had a huge economic impact on our production as well. We're coming in with all these other chemicals, all these different products that we have to purchase in order to grow the same potato crop to solve a problem that we created ourselves. But the trouble with these nematicides too is, we're so worried about the parasitic nematodes that are causing problems to the potatoes, but the parasitic nematodes are only a small portion of the total population of nematodes in the soil. The parasitic nematodes only make up about 10% of the total population of all the nematodes in the soil. The other 90% are actually very beneficial to this potato crop. A lot of them control other pests, and a lot of them have a lot to do with nutrient cycling in the soil. So here, if we're applying these nematicides, trying to take care of that one pest, we're damaging how the rest of the system functions as well, and now we're creating other potential problems by taking this approach. Now, fertility was one of the hardest ones for us to figure out about this, because no matter what, when we're growing a potato crop, if we're harvesting that crop and removing that crop from the system, we're exporting nutrients, right? So at some point, we're going to have to bring some nutrients back in. So we thought, well, obviously, we're not going to be able to get away from fertility. But the problem wasn't the fact that we were adding fertility, but it was the form that the fertility was in is where we were causing these problems. We were using synthetic forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, the trouble with these synthetic forms of fertilizer is they are very harsh on a couple of, two very good examples is nitrogen-fixing bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi. And the list goes on and on. But there are bacteria that live in the soil that can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and add it to the soil for us. Now, mycorrhizal fungi can take phosphorus from the soil and make it available to the plant. But it turns out both of these absolutely hate living in the presence of synthetic fertilizers. So once we start adding synthetic fertilizers to the system, we shut down a couple of naturally occurring components that were adding fertility to the soil for us. So now we don't have them functioning properly, so now we have to put more synthetic fertilizers on to offset that. So once again, that comes with a price tag, and that has an impact on the economics as well. So here's a paper I really encourage everybody to read. It's by Dr. Christine Jones. If you guys go to amazingcarbon.com, Everything I just talked about as far as the mycorrhiza and the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, she does a really good job in here talking about how those synthetic fertilizers are so devastating to both of those. So I would really encourage you guys to go on and read that so you can expand your knowledge even beyond what we're talking about here today. So there's something else that comes along with these synthetic fertilizers, right? Not only are they harmful to the mycorrhiza, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, but they also come with heavy amounts of salt. So just overall, it creates a very harmful environment in the soil. Because does anything like to live in a high amount of salt? You know, when we butcher a hog, first thing we do is we take that bacon and add a bunch of salt to it, right? Why are we doing that? So we can cure it and preserve it, because nothing's going to live on there. So we're basically doing the same thing to these soils too when we're adding all these synthetic fertilizers. We're creating an environment where nothing wants to live there. So I think one thing that's really neat about putting this all together, and the reason I first started putting these slides together like this is when we first started making some transitions, I had to do this for myself just to kind of figure out how all these things fit together. But I thought it was kind of neat looking at what a central hub life in the soil became. You see how many times we have arrows coming in and out of that? That life in the soil is very important. But we had to expand our knowledge even beyond that because we really had to start thinking about carbon and soil structure as well. Because we grow potatoes, so the process of harvesting potatoes is a pretty massive soil disturbance. So we can be pretty harsh on our soil structure just from the physical disturbance. But the trouble is if we don't have any life in the soil, we don't have anything to put those soil aggregates back together. When you have soil particles in the soil, the bacteria and the fungi are the ones that actually glue them together and start building these aggregates to create the environment they like living in. And without carbon to feed that life in the soil, they don't have the ability to do their job, and the carbon itself adds to the soil structure. So these three have a very important relationship with each other. If you go in and damage one of those, you're going to hurt the other two as well. And that's what we were doing by using this system of farming. So now that we had very little life in the soil, we had poor soil structure, and we had very little carbon in the soil, this was having a huge impact on our water. Now, I mentioned before, water is a very scarce commodity in our area. It drives a lot of our decisions, but we were also being very wasteful with our water as well. And you become very inefficient with how you're utilizing this water when you don't have that soil structure and the life, and even the high salts from the fertilizer can have an impact on this as well. Now, the other thing that comes along with poor soil structure are problems like this. So not only are, we're affecting water infiltration rate and a lot of things as far as how the water interacts with the plant, but we were having physical problems out there as well. So growing up, we had one center pivot where we just knew that every single year it was going to get buried, just like this picture here. We just accepted it as fact, and what did we blame? We blamed the soil type. We said, well, the soil type on that field in that area is just going to do that every single year. So we had straw bales stacked up out in that corner. We would run it a couple times, get stuck out there, go with our straw bales, work it back and forth a few times and get that sprinkler out of there and move on with life. But the trouble is, I really like this picture because it really emphasizes some of the other problems that come along with poor soil structure. But the trouble is, I couldn't go out to my field to take this picture. I had to go over to the neighbor's field to take this picture. And the reason I emphasize that is here we were blaming soil type. But the trouble is we don't have this problem anymore, but the neighbors still do. So the soil type wasn't the problem, it was how we were managing the soil. So now we have poor soil structure. Now we have a crop that's being over-irrigated. We have a saturated soil with very little pore space. We end up with very poor gas exchange as a result of this. Now we have created the ideal environment for a lot of the diseases to thrive. The diseases in the soil that affect potato crops that are most damaging really don't like oxygen. They thrive in anaerobic conditions. So here we were abusing our soil and creating the environment where those diseases liked to thrive. So that means we're coming in with more fungicides, more fumigants, trying to stay on top of these problems. Also, the plants were wet more often because we were having to over-irrigate the crop because the water and the soil weren't interacting very well together, and we were very inefficient with our water use. And this was having an impact on our weed pressure as well as some other factors. So the weeds that we were dealing with back then, there was two in particular that were really problematic for us. We were dealing with a lot with sunflowers and nightshade. Now there's some really good charts out there. If you go onto Google and start looking up weeds as indicators, if you look up both of those weeds on those charts, they were indicators of some problems that we had in our soil. So usually those two weeds are something that you would expect to see in a soil with very, very poor structure, very low carbon, and a lot of times weeds are an indicator of a chemical imbalance in your soil as well. You know, the other one that I added in there most recently was beneficial insects. This one, it took me a while to kind of grasp onto, but did you know there's a lot of different beneficial insects that thrive on the surface of the soil where weed seeds are a major component of their diet? So what that means is if they're eating those weed seeds, they're removing them from the seed bank and they can't germinate the next year. But the trouble is if we're coming in with these insecticides and trying to remove all insects from this crop, now we no longer have those scavenger insects out there to consume those weeds. So there's a lot of different components here that all add to these problems that we're creating ourselves. So now if we have a weed problem out there, of course we're going to have to come in with a herbicide to try controlling these weeds because they were in such a population they were competing with the potato crop. But once again, you have to be very careful when you start using this approach too, because these herbicides, if you use the wrong chemical at the wrong time, you can actually damage the potato crop itself. So one of the very first things we removed from our systems was actually herbicide. We wanted to just try removing one of the sides, and so we relied completely on tillage for weed control. But the thing is, just like Don was talking about, the damages that come along with tillage excessively. Like I mentioned, I'm a potato grower. I'm never going to be no-till. That's not something that's going to happen on my farm, but we've definitely done a lot to reduce tillage on our farm as much as possible. Because every time we do go through and disturb that soil, we are losing carbon, we are physically breaking apart that soil structure, and we are damaging the life in the soil. A lot of these fungi in there are very fragile, and it doesn't take a lot to really destroy that system there. So this was the system that we were using on our farm. It seems like every time we tried solving one problem, we were creating a whole new problem for ourselves. And it was just very defeating. We got very frustrated with the system. So we wanted to take a completely different approach. But what's really nice about soils is it doesn't matter how bad we screw them up or how bad we hurt them, there's always a chance to rebuild that soil. We can always wipe the slate clean and start everything over. But we definitely have to take a completely different approach when we start doing this.